All right, welcome to CCL's December breakout for Talking to Conservatives. I really appreciate you being here. Pleasure to see so many familiar faces that I know in the audience, as well as a number of names and faces that I'm less familiar with, and a pleasure to see John Clark's dog dancing. All the lines are muted except the speakers. We will have time for questions that you can send by using the chat that just goes to the host. So if you have questions that you'd like to have considered for the panel, please go ahead and feel free to put those into the chat, and we'll take a look at them and get some questions to the speakers after they have a chance to introduce themselves. Some quick context on conservatives and CCL. We do have measures and metrics that we can point to with pride on the growth of the actions of conservatives and CCL and the growth of our Conservative Caucus Action Team, an action team for people right of center in CCL. In January of 2017, we had 58 people in the Conservative Caucus, and that included some that we now call Friends of the Conservative Caucus. 4 years later, this month, we now have 792 members of the Conservative Caucus who are right of center, and another 287 friends of the Conservative Caucus, for over 1,000 people on our Conservative Caucus Action Team. We can also look with pride to just the significant shift that Republicans have when they speak about climate and climate action, where we are, as conservatives, we are now talking about a lot more solutions. There are a lot more pieces on the table and moving. That said, we also have a lot of work in front of us, both recruiting, retaining, and activating conservatives in CCL, as well as in America today, when Republicans call for action on climate change, the acceptable policies that they're putting on the table typically are not including carbon pricing, and we need to work hard to get that window to shift so that carbon pricing is included in the acceptable policies that Republicans frequently, regularly talk about when they're talking about actions on climate. So today, what we want to do with this panel is to have a glimpse of 3 conservative CCL supporters who are working with conservatives and on conservative outreach, and hear from them directly about what's working for them. The examples may lend themselves most directly to other conservatives in the audience, though I think everyone can learn as we listen to what has been working for outreach for these conservatives. And as a reminder, all the panelists will talk, introduce themselves, and have a chance to talk. And then after that, we will pose some questions to them, and I'll be looking at questions put into the chat for consideration for the panel. So first up is Tom Moyer. Tom is CCL State Coordinator in Utah. Tom is a mechanical engineer with a bachelor's from Stanford and a master's in robotics from MIT. For his day job, Tom designs robotic systems. Tom has also built the most documented green home that I know of that you can find by following his Twitter feed. But today, Tom is here to talk to us about starting to engage conservative CCL supporters working on a team on conservative outreach in Utah. Tom, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Jim. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about Utah and what we've done to become more conservative as a CCL organization and to grow a conservative action team in our state. We have been, in my opinion, phenomenal bridge builders in the state, talking to both environmental organizations on the left and talking to a very conservative state legislature. We have not ourselves actually been all that conservative. We draw, like the rest of CCL, mostly from center-left members who care about the environment. And we've done an amazing job of teaching them to be effective citizen lobbyists in a primarily conservative environment. Our federal delegation, starting in January, is going to be 100% Republican. Our state legislature right now is 79% Republican. It's important that we keep Democrats and we keep left-leaning organizations in our tent, but nothing in our state is going to happen without significant support on the Republican side. We have, in our state, a couple of years ago, we passed the first climate resolution in a red state. It's called the Environmental and Economic Stewardship Resolution. And to do that, that really started our outreach efforts to the legislature in all districts in the state. And that sort of forced us to grow and actually talk to CCL members in rural parts of the state. And it unintentionally brought us in a little bit more conservative membership. But a lot of those people really have not been that engaged. And it's important that we grow that side of our organization if we really want to be effective at this. That climate resolution has now grown to what's called the Utah Roadmap towards emissions reductions, both air pollution and greenhouse gases. And it's now become a group of business supporters called the Utah Climate and Clean Air Compact. So we're starting to see really broad-based support, including from our federal delegation, for these sorts of pragmatic steps to cut emissions. And I have to let you all know, as red as we are as a state, we're not actually very much like other red states. There's a significant pragmatic streak in our state. We're very immigrant friendly, we're very voting rights friendly, and we hope that we can also be very climate friendly, that we can be the ones that really lead red states on climate action. So what we've been doing lately, really at the request of CCL, is to start building out a conservative action team in the state. We have really good alliances with groups like Young Conservatives for Carbon Dividends, where they draw on people who grew up in the Republican Party in the state, who grew up being precinct chairs, who grew up being caucus delegates, who grew up being state Republican chairs. We don't have anybody like that in CCL. we have a fairly good group of what I would call right of center folks who are good at speaking conservative, but we don't have anybody with those kind of deep Republican roots and credibility. And they're the kind of people we need. So we've now started outreach efforts. We have now a broader list to draw from of CCL members who are right of center, and we've begun calling each and every one of them. And we're just at the beginning stages of this, but we've now had one conservative action team meeting. And from that, we've already gotten 2 new people to lobby with us in a week, and 1 new liaison to what will be our new District 1 congressman. So look forward to hearing what Nate and Kelsey have to say. Thanks for listening.
Great, thanks, Tom. And next up is Nate Hochman. For those of us who read conservative news, Nate may not need much of an introduction, but for those of you who are first meeting him here today, Nate has 18 pieces published across the National Review and another 8 pieces published in one of my favorite news sources, The Dispatch. Nate has a rather broad conservative portfolio, and Nate he has accomplished this as a senior at Colorado College, where he's studying political science and journalism. Currently a Conservative Outreach Fellow at CCL. His comments will build on his experience as a Summer Honors Academy student at the American Enterprise Institute, an editorial intern at National Review, and a summer fellow at the Dispatch. As each of us look at our writing and trying to set our own goals a little higher than they were last year, Nate can provide maybe some insight on getting conservative pieces published in our local papers and regional papers and even national outlets. Nate, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And thanks everyone for coming and giving us a little bit of your Saturday morning. I'm in Oregon, but I guess it's probably afternoon in the East. So I guess essentially what I'm talking about is trying to communicate to a conservative audience through generally the written word, which is the thing that I have the most experience with, about climate change. So by virtue of that, I think this is specifically or particularly addressed to conservatives in the audience who are interested in writing, op-eds for their local paper, et cetera. But it's also, I think, something that progressives should be paying attention to as well, because we are not going to achieve, a successful climate policy as a country if we don't convince a sizable portion of Republicans and conservatives. We are more or less a 50-50 country. And we need to learn how to better make the case to conservatives and Republican voters that climate action is something that should have bipartisan support. So I think the thing that is, in my experience, will get you the most success in pitching to conservative media and getting your article placed, and then actually writing an effective article that convinces people, is having a unique angle. So being able to say essentially why you are someone who should be writing about climate change, and why your perspective is unique and interesting and isn't something that these people have heard or published a million times before. And learning how to use language that is understandable to conservatives in communicating that. I think one of the problems with the partisan polarization around the issue of climate change is for a large portion of the environmentalist movement, climate action and climate policy is relatively indistinguishable from the larger sort of progressive worldview or progressive policy agenda. So the language that we use to talk about climate change is explicitly progressive most of the time, right? You know, terms like climate justice, this sort of intersectionality view of climate change, regardless of what you think of it, that's the way that groups like the Sierra Club and the League of Conservation Voters, and certainly, you know, groups like the Sunrise Movement use to talk about climate change. That is going to turn off conservative voters, right? And a conservative audience. And there's no, in my opinion, at least, there's no need to talk that way about climate change. Climate, in my opinion, and conservation more broadly, is fundamentally, or can be, a conservative value. And, you know, Jim mentioned that I've written for National Review a lot, not exclusively about this topic, but I had a feature piece in their September print issue about, it was called Toward a Conservative Environmentalism. And it was essentially making the case to conservatives using conservative language that environmentalism is a conservative value, and that it's not something that should be exclusively monopolized by progressives. So I'd invite you to all, you know, go read that if you're curious of, I think, a decent example of what that looks like. I can set it in the chat. But there is a language that conservatives use to talk about issues that is often very different from the language that progressives use to talk about issues, even if we're essentially talking about a very similar thing. So rather, I would encourage people, progressives and conservatives alike, rather than talking about climate justice, dismantling systems of oppression, overcoming capitalism, right? These things that are often associated with the environmentalist left, talking about heritage and preserving our inheritance and our duty to one another and a love of country. I mean, right? One of the things that I think makes America exceptional is our natural inheritance. There's no other country quite like ours in terms of the wide, vast, wild open spaces that we have. And that's something that, you know, a lot of conservatives come from rural areas and have a sort of intrinsic, instinctual understanding of that. So appeal to that, and try to take a angle based on your own personal experience, and talk from a personal experience, which makes it interesting to people. And the last thing, I guess, is just, unfortunately, the other feature of our partisan polarization around climate change is that a lot of people on my side of the aisle have an instinctual negative reaction to climate change, because Jim and I were talking about this off the call. It's become a culture war issue, unfortunately, right? So conservatives view climate change as indistinguishable from progressive cosmopolitanism, you know, liberal cultural values, et cetera, et cetera. So in order to make the case to a conservative audience, which is probably going to be instinctually skeptical, you have to, in my opinion, distinguish yourself from the progressives who are sort of dominating the environmentalist movement, right? And that means emphasizing the fact that you're conservative, emphasizing the fact that, you know, you're not a squish, you're not someone who's trying to just convince conservatives to give up their values and just become a lefty, right? That you are someone who shares their fundamental worldview, and that caring about environmentalism and climate change specifically isn't a contradiction to that, right? It's actually, in my opinion, conservation is a conservative value, right? So, you know, in the National Review piece, I think that Jim just sent, right, one thing that I made a point of doing is criticizing what I saw as the excesses of the environmentalist left and the sort of left-wing approach to environmentalism. Now, if you're a progressive, you'll disagree with me, but the point of the article is to disarm the sort of instinctual negative reaction that a lot of Republicans have to climate change by showing them that you're on their side before proceeding to say, hey, but, you know, this climate change issue is a real issue, and you know, we should be caring about it. So, you know, don't lecture your audience, your conservative audience, about how bad conservatives are on environmental issues, right? Emphasize that you share their worldview, emphasize, the real positive progress that we've seen in the Republican Party in the last few years, especially on environmental issues and even climate change. And, insofar as you do criticize the Republican Party or conservatives for not being where we need them to be on climate change, which is absolutely true, do it gently and within a larger sort of discussion of the fact that we are making progress and moving in the right direction, but we have a long way to go. So that's, I think that's not exclusively true of writing for conservative magazines, right? This is a larger way to talk to conservatives in general about climate change. But specifically, if you're pitching an article to a conservative outlet, or you're going on, Fox, like I do sometimes, or talk radio and whatnot, you need to get there in the first place. And then subsequently, to be convincing, you need to be able to speak their language, and you need to be able to not do what some progressives do sometimes, which is talk down to them. So yeah, I guess that's sort of the preliminary thoughts I have on that.
Great, thanks, Nate. And our third panelist is Kelsey Grant. Kelsey is a Conservative Outreach Fellow at CCL also, and was formerly a CCL Higher Education Fellow. Kelsey's a senior at the University of Colorado, where she's studying political science and philosophy. Kelsey has also been a Sunday school teacher for her congregation at a United Church of Christ, a tutor for elementary school students, and a family mentor for Lutheran Refugee Family Services. Kelsey's been working to build relationships with Republicans in Colorado rather successfully. Kelsey, the floor is yours.
Great. So happy to be here. Like Jim mentioned, a meaningful portion of my work in Colorado has involved outreach to partisan Republicans and groups. This often takes several forms, but one significant result of my outreach occurred a few months ago when a Republican candidate for Congress by the name of Charlie co-authored 2 opinion pieces with me on the need for restored conservative leadership on climate, and also on the merits of carbon pricing. And so to explain this, I'll also kind of tell of like a story to let you know the background that went into this. But about a year ago, Charlie approached me as a candidate and also as a skeptic of carbon pricing, and specifically HR 763, when he spoke to my college Republican group on campus. And he shared his campaign vision with us, and to my delight, he wanted to focus on issues important to my generation, had a very strong emphasis on bipartisanship. So he had fantastic ideas for his campaign, which I already appreciated and respected. But more than anything, I wanted to help him connect the values of his campaign to climate action, and specifically carbon pricing, because he was a leader who I cherished, and I really wanted to see him take it one step further. So what followed was about a year of many shared conversations between Charlie and I. We would talk at Republican events together. We'd speak over Zoom. He invited myself and other members of the CU College Republicans to talk about issues that we cared about. Sometimes we talk about how to engage youth, COVID policy bipartisanship, enhancing the public discourse. We spoke about nuclear all the time, and we would also speak about carbon pricing. Even though Charlie would occasionally express some reservations with carbon fee and dividend, he always heard me out, and he always listened when I tried to give my own case for carbon pricing, and he took what I had to say very seriously. So those conversations really laid the foundation for a strong, meaningful relationship. They highlight the important values and hopes that we had in common, and it led to a shared desire for us to put out an intergenerational message on conservative leadership, bipartisanship, and even carbon pricing. And so we decided to co-author a few op-eds together, and they were published throughout the state. And they also caught the attention of other Republican elected officials who read them and reached out to us, praising us for the message that we were sharing. Now Charlie is a phenomenal mentor of mine, and I often seek out his guidance and advice as I engage more and more in politics, and he's always willing to help me as a young person in my endeavors. So if there's one thing that I would hope that this audience would take away from this, is that good faith, caring, and mutually beneficial conversations, and as abstract as that sounds, are incredibly important and valuable. And in all of my conservative outreach relationships are always carrying it forward. but also, these relationships with Republicans in our lives, whether that is a family member or a candidate for Congress, they really do expand the opportunities in front of us to amplify the conservative voice in the climate space. And lastly, if a public official or any eventual congressional candidates were to hear what I'm saying today, I'd also hope that what they could take away from this is for them to, maybe look to Charlie's example a little bit. He made young people a priority. He made us feel valued and seriously listened to us. He always took our concerns and ideas seriously. And I hope in the next election cycle, there will be more Republican candidates like him for myself and for other conservatives in the audience to engage with. And so those are my thoughts.
Great, thank you, Kelsey. Some good questions have been coming in. Thank you for posting them up. And maybe I'll swing back to Tom for a first one. So some people have expressed a question on how do you talk about people in transition, the jobs transition that's in front of people, particularly like in Wyoming, Montana, the Appalachian region, and counties in Utah. It certainly is an issue that you have to confront in Utah. How do you go about that conversation? Do you have any recommendations? And then other panelists can chime in if you want.
Yeah, it's absolutely a front and center topic here. We have coal towns that have been in decline for the last decade, who are they're still holding on, unlike a lot of towns in Appalachia and Wyoming that have already sort of experienced the collapse. The ones in Utah are still hanging on by their fingernails, but there's widespread recognition that they have a dwindling amount of time left. So there's a great project in Utah called the Coal Country Strike Team, which is specifically aimed at building economic diversification in those communities. It has nothing to do with ending coal, it's just building them some alternative industry. And that's got great support from their member of Congress, John Curtis. And he's out there. It's got great support from the mayors of those towns. And that we think that is sort of the route forward for those communities in general in the state, is talking about how we're going to build their economy, not how we're going to tear it down.
Great, thanks, Tom. Any other thoughts, Kelsey and Nate? I'll hop on to the next question. So within conservative circles, there is as wide of a range of people and backgrounds in the conservative world as there is in our whole world. And a reader used as an example, or a questioner used as an example, a conservative. So somebody that's maybe farther to the right. Do you have suggestions for influencing people, a conservative in their world, somebody that is much more rooted in getting their news from only conservative circles that maybe push back a little harder? Nate, you want to start with that one? This is really right in the sweet spot of your work.
Yeah, I mean, as I think the token conservative at CCL, I'm probably not the only one. I mean, I'm pretty conservative. You go down the sort of list of issues. I'm very conservative on pretty much everything. And the case that I've made to my fellow conservatives is that caring about climate change and being an environmentalist isn't a contradiction to that, right? Now, I think there's probably a difference between being a very conservative in terms of your actual policy stances and the sort of larger apparatus of cultural conservatism, which includes the media that you consume and, sort of opposition to, environmental issues, et cetera. And overcoming that, I think, is, at the risk of being repetitive, showing people that, you are not, the first step in sort of breaking down what I think is a pretty toxic narrative that people get sometimes from the conservative media ecosystem about climate change is by, breaking the idea that everyone who cares about climate change is sort of a raging leftist, right? And once you do that, that opens up spaces for conversations that, people might step back and take a second look at the issue. But establishing that connection first, before launching into sort of a diatribe about, why climate change is a serious issue, I think is the first step to making those connections.
And I'll just chime in really quickly. I want to reiterate, take everything Nate just said. That was perfectly stated. In my experience, I don't struggle with conservatives. I struggle with people who have very strong partisan attachments. That seems like the biggest battle for me. I don't find it particularly difficult helping people understand how environmentalism connects to conservative values. My biggest problem is getting people to trust me and trying to help them find some distance between their initial uneasiness and skepticism with hearing me talk about conservatism and environmentalism. That's just how partisan politics works. Tribalism, you have a gut reaction to people who are talking perhaps a little bit more like the group that you're typically opposed to. So this kind of goes back to my original point on the importance of building relationships. The foundation to a good relationship is trust. So if you're talking about a conservative or a partisan Republican, focus and emphasize relationship building first. And not really like when you first encounter a Republican or someone who's very, very partisan, I wouldn't even emphasize climate at first. Just focus on getting to know the person initially. Don't even bring it up, the climate issue. And that trust will really carry you pretty far.
We have 4 minutes remaining in the call.
Great, thanks for the reminder, and thanks, Kelsey. Tom, I'll throw this one to you to start. So a question on rural, as you look at conservative overlap with Utah, you have to face this challenge of having a lot of people in the cities and a lot of conservatives in your more rural parts of the state. How have you addressed that or looked at that challenge, and are there any suggestions you might have for other states that are looking at similar challenges?
Boy, I can tell you that our divide on climate change in the state is really not so much conservative liberal as it is urban rural. We have great support among urban conservatives. We do not have great support among rural conservatives. And that is where we need to get stronger, because we're primarily an urban organization. We have, one or two CCL members in some of these rural districts. And that's an area for us to try to grow.
Any strategies you're using?
Yeah, a lot of phone calls.
Yeah.
when we get somebody in those areas, we're going to try hard to hook them and bring them in, get them engaged, because we don't have that many.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Kelsey, you mentioned building these relationships out. As you, especially you brought up the example of working with a politician who you first met because they specifically opposed the legislation you were supporting. What are the main objections that you've had raised to a carbon dividends approach, and how have you addressed those?
We have about 90 seconds on the call.
Okay, I'll speak about one concern that many people in the audience probably heard. I frequently hear, the money collected by the dividends will not be returned back to the citizens, and this is fueled by a mistrust of the government. And my response, in my experience, it's typically well received. I will tell them, well, do you trust Republicans to, collect money and return it to the people? And they often do. Those are typically the political figures and politicians that they put a lot of trust in. And say, okay, then fine, let's support pro-climate Republicans, get them into Congress. And then they feel a lot more comfortable thinking about those people imposing or supporting a carbon fee in dividends, and they trust that they will return them back to the people. So the response to the skepticism over the dividend is, in short, Republican leadership in the climate space.
Kelsey, I'm totally stealing that.
Great. All right.
I have needed the perfect answer to that question.
We are going to close down, and I appreciate everybody making it here today. I hope you will join the rest of the sessions. I particularly hope you will make it all the way through to the end. And for the 4:40 session, we're going to have Representative Deutsch, the sponsor of our bill, the lead sponsor of Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividends Act, along with one of our board members, Dr. Natasha Desjarnette, for the closeout session. And before that, I encourage you to go back to the program and explore some of the other options you have in front of you today. So thank you very much for attending, and all of us would be interested in any follow-up if you want to reach out to us. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.